Welcome to What's Your Story podcast. I'm your host, Matt Story. On this pod, I sit down with people of color leaders to understand how they've been able to use their superpowers to make an impact on our world. And I do it one story at a time. My guest on the pod this week is a female immigrant founder with 13 years of experience as a successful executive at the likes of PayPal, Microsoft, and Hitachi. She's currently the CEO of Criya, which is an AI tech startup backed by Combinator and other top VCs. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about her story. So please welcome Deb Dutta to the show.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. The pleasure's mine. I appreciate you jumping on the mic and being willing to share your story with me. But before we get into learning all about your journey, I wonder if you could take us back and maybe start with a story about what little Deb may have been like.
Oh, gosh. So just for context, right, I'm a first generation immigrant and I was always a computer nerd, like right when I was a little kid. Just for context, I came to Carnegie Mellon, studied computer science, started my career at Microsoft and so on. So I took the path of a technologist, but little Deb was I'm a very creative person and I always love to create stuff. And I love to create visually appealing stuff. Like that was always a thing for me. And that went anywhere from doing little DIY projects at home all the way to, computers was really not so much about the technology as much as it was, I could get to go in and like create cool things. Like it's really more about that. So that's really who I was. I was a good kid.
That's awesome. And I love that combination of the technology and the creativity and how you can bridge both of those worlds. But when you were growing up, did you have an idea of what you wanted to be and like, I want to be this when I grow up?
So Matt, I'm born and raised in India, right? So I come from a pretty middle class home. Really a big part of my life was, getting to a stable job, being able to support my parents. So even for me, a lot of, even coming to the States, my American dream was hopefully I can pay off my loans, send money back home and be able to get on and like help my family and me move on to a better place financially and so on. So no, doing what I'm doing today, entrepreneurship was, I always say this, I didn't go looking for entrepreneurship. I feel like entrepreneurship found me. So yeah.
No, I think that's amazing because it's like you knew the impact you wanted to make, even though you may not have been able to put it into a job or put it into a role, which actually gave you probably a lot more flexibility on how you could execute against that. I'm curious how your upbringing and your ability to tap into being, first generation immigrant, being in the technology field and all those things, like how do you feel growing up gave you skills that allowed you to really set you apart, but also things that you pull from as you went through your journey? Was there anything that you learned early on, which you still use today?
Certainly. I think, especially the path I am on today, I'm an entrepreneur of a tech company as a female solo founder, raising in a venture world where less than 2% capital is deployed toward female founders and so on, right? So I already know that the stakes are like they're stacked up against me, right? The one thing that I think my upbringing has taught me is resilience and just doing what I can, which is in my control, right? That's the only thing I can do. And a lot of times I remember my dad would often tell me, we look at some people and we think, they got lucky. Luck is a function of how many doors you knocked on. If you only knock on 3 doors, none are going to open. But if you knocked on 100, maybe 2 would, right? So I think really it's a question of I'm incredibly hardworking and it comes from my background. I'm incredibly resilient. And I think ultimately as a founder and as an entrepreneur, those are the skills that are tested the more than anything else, to be honest. So yeah. I feel like that's what shaped me up to be where I am today.
No, that's great. I do love that idea of like that the luck only happens when you put in that work and when you put in the preparation and you're willing to have that resiliency to stick it out because it does get tough. Yeah. But I want to jump into your professional journey. And, you've had experiences at the likes of Microsoft, Cisco, Hitachi, PayPal, which a lot of people would love to work at those companies and be in those organizations and to work, especially in the tech world, in product there. But I'm curious, what surprised you about being in those rooms, being in those institutions as you were growing your career? And was it consistent or was it different in the various stops?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so much growth through all of this, right? I've only worked at big companies. So I was always fortunate to be surrounded by people who were already 2 steps ahead of me. And I had like someone to look up to follow after. The interesting thing for me was when I said I was a computer nerd. So I always imagined that I would stay in a highly technical engineering role from day zero all the way till the very end. I follow a lot in my dad's footsteps. He's my role model. And he's like a heavily research oriented technical person. I always thought that's who I would be. Interestingly, I feel like my career path has, and especially working into organizations that help me get to where I flourished the most, which is product. It was a function of really taking those chances, opening up to my bosses and saying, well, I stayed up till 2 a.m. trying to fix these bugs. Pretty sure I'm not doing a great job, not because I'm not working hard. I think I'm meant to do something else. You guys got to open some doors for me out here. It really was that, because I think all along I was looking for, I need to shine. I want to shine in this room. And if there was something that I'm putting in like 200%, but I'm getting out maybe 20%, something's off with that equation. So I kept looking for opportunities, and like that's really where, like, once I eventually was at PayPal, I think I thrived the most. Only because I felt like I was doing exactly what I was meant to do. I was really surrounded with projects and opportunities that really helped me excel in my profession.
So you touched on something there that I think a lot of us come to grips with at some point in our journey. And you mentioned that your father's your kind of role model, and you kind of looked at that as like, oh, he's been successful here. This is how I can replicate that success to have the impact that I want to have. But once you got into it, you started to realize like maybe some of these things aren't necessarily my calling, or maybe, I can work really hard, but it's not getting that output. Like how did you adjust to that, or how did you get comfortable with that? Because I'm assuming your schooling was for that, and I'm assuming as you were paying off the loans you were like, hey, I've got to turn this into what that goal I set for myself was. But there was probably a lot of conversations you had to have with yourself to be comfortable to even voice that to someone, that like, hey, I don't think this is working out, or I don't think this is what I'm meant to do. Like, how did you get comfortable in that space?
Truthfully, I don't think it ever, like, every time you feel like you're getting comfortable, in my head, I feel like every time I'm getting comfortable, it means I'm getting complacent. And for me, that's a step back versus a step, like, I don't think you're ever in the same place. You're only taking a step back. So it's been that, I mean, I think that's also a little bit, to be honest, of the middle class, of the immigrant mentality that I've grown up in. There is a sense of, you always need to push forward. There is that thing that I've grown up with. So I think being uncomfortable with where I'm at is something I'm actually comfortable with. But interestingly, like you said, I had to figure a way around this, or like I had to figure a way out of this. And I knew that there was a different destination for me, and this is not my path. And that's an interesting story, because I think it's a question of, well, there's a shiny object. Everyone's doing MBAs, or everyone's doing product management and working at these big name companies. But everyone wants to do that. How will they pick you versus someone else? So what's the path together? So for me, that was like the puzzle I wanted to solve. Like, I know where I want to be, but how do I get there from my current background and educational and training?
No, it's so fascinating that what you called out of like, when you're comfortable, you're actually moving back, and like putting those two together, because I'm 100% the same line of thinking, that there's no way to stay in where you are today. You're either moving forward or you're moving backwards, because everything's changing around us. So it's up to you to make the choice. Like, am I moving backwards, or am I going to do things that help me move forward? And so that brings me to ask, like, how did you find your way to this entrepreneurial journey? And like, how did you find that path, which again is even more steep and even more challenging?
Yeah, that's a question I like. Even my parents and I have this conversation all the time. Like, well, you already went into product, which itself was such a diversion from what I had earlier. But so Matt, like I said, I think I've always been a creative person. So I've always had side projects. So from like my first job, I think, and even in grad school, I went to Carnegie Mellon and I studied computer science. I did my master's. But I was part of these other student body associations and so on. So I've always wanted to have this other personality to me. So from there, fast forward, I remember I was at one of the big name companies, and this was during the time where layoffs were rampant. They still are now, 12 years since then, I think, but it was rampant. So, and I always knew that I'm that kid, like, I'll like raise my hand. I'm always the person who's like, I'm hardworking. I will take on that project. I'll do that extra, effort. But then during these layoffs, the one thing that really bothered me was, well, I could lose my job, and it may have not very little to do with my current performance.
Mm-hmm.
Second was, I may not lose my job, but maybe I may be moved to a different boss. My ecosystem is going to change, but today my entire reputation is tied to this boss and this team. You see what I'm saying? So
Hmm.
I that made me uncomfortable. Like, it bothered me. I was like, I am more than like this. I don't want my reputation to just be tied to this one opportunity and this one title and position. So from very early on, I started being intentional about having projects outside of my day job that would continue to build, obviously, my skill set, but also my visibility. So really, that's how it started. So I started, and I would do anything. Like, I would volunteer a ton at events that I wanted to eventually be speaking at, and that's how I started getting speaking opportunities. I started messaging and texting and writing a lot of articles, and then I eventually started writing for Forbes. Um, and then I was actively posting on Instagram. To when I really mastered the Instagram algorithm, we grew to I grew to about 170,000 followers and started getting a whole bunch of DMs about things I would post about, and like really turn into like semi coaching practice, if you may. It was never None of this ever had any monetary implications. I was happy with my job, so this was never bound by monetization objective, which is very liberating because you could be your best self. And really, that was where the birth of Kriya came about, where like all these skill sets and learnings put together into, how do I turn this into something that's maybe a duplicatable um, skill set for everybody.
You said so many things in there that I think were just very insightful. But the idea of looking for things beyond your job that give you skill sets and visibility, I think that's like a cheat code for today's professional, no matter what you're doing, no matter where you are in your journey. Um, so let's talk a little bit about Kriya and like what you're trying to do and kind of what you're providing to help the person behind you be able to do exactly what you did, just faster and with AI and whatnot.
Yeah, so really, I mean, in a nutshell, my company is called Criya. We're a Y Combinator backed, venture backed AI startup. Really, what we tried to do when we started out was, it was simple. An investor is going to Google you, a hiring manager is going to Google you, a date is going to Google you, right? And you probably have, what, 6 to 7 seconds to make an impression. So the whole idea was, how do we help people make stellar first impressions? And today with AI, and I'm obsessed about visual content, so combine the two together, we spin up a fantastic looking, think of it like a web page for you that demonstrates everything that you do. So this was the birth of the technology that we built. But today, really, what that's transformed into is, we live in a highly competitive market, and personal branding is one of those aspects. But really, what we've done is, we've built technology that makes you do your profession really, really well and make you look exceptional. So idea being that you can key in a couple of keywords and you can spin up perfectly designed, interactive, professional looking collateral, whether that's a sales deck or a business proposal or fundraising deck. So we spin up fantastic looking web accessible content in seconds.
That definitely sounds like something all of us need at our fingertips and able to tap into, because I think personal branding in general just has a bad personal brand, because when you say it, people tend to think like, oh, that means I got to brag, or that means I'm talking about why I'm so great, and so I'm curious for you, like, how do you overcome that with your audience or your customers? Like, how do you help them realize, which I believe, whether you work on it or not, you have a personal brand. So why not make it better? But I'm curious, how do you address that and help them see the opportunity they have by leveraging your tools?
It's exactly what you said, Matt. I think the truth is, whether you like it or not, you have a personal brand that follows you. And what is a personal brand? It's really it's your reputation, right? It's a function of the work that you've done, the values you stand by, what the world sees you as. Now, if you don't work on it, the world's going to make assumptions about what they want to about you. But if you work on it and you're intentional about how you curate the messages you put out, or like the impression you want people to have about you, then you have an opportunity. So really, I think the question, though, it's about reframing it and saying, it's not, you already have a personal brand. Do you want to take control of what people think of you or not?
As I mentioned, and you also referenced it, being accepted into Y Combinators, like, that's a big deal. And it's very competitive, super prestigious once you actually make it through there. But I'm curious, like what was your journey going through that? You mentioned, you know, women get very small percentage of overall VC funding. Women of color get even less percentage of VC funding. So, like, how was your journey, both applying, being accepted, and then from there taking it even to more heights?
And so let me step a couple of like a little bit back before I get into how YC happened. So like I said, I was always, I was always putting myself out there. I was all these ideas were coming to me over years. It wasn't a question of months, right? So I started coding the first version of Criya sometime ago. And this was just a side hustle. Like I already had a computer science background. And pretty quickly, I had like close to 600 users join us. This is while I was head of product at PayPal. I was running teams across seven times, seven locations and so on. So I had a full time job and that I loved. This was always meant to be a side gig. But then when we had so many users coming on board, I realized it's bigger than me. And the first thing I wanted to do was go register this entity because this needed to be a business and not be running on my name just to like secure myself. And I was told, you're not an American citizen yet, so you cannot do this, even though it was just a side project for free. So, and I had already been in this country for 13 plus years. I was already, I had reputable accomplishments or credibility to my backing, and yet as an Indian I would have to wait another 15 years at minimum to get my green card. So this is really where it started to bug me. I was just like, well, this is a problem that I want to solve, but I have no way to to get around it. So long story short, I remember, I spoke to and this is why I think I was always blessed with the best, bosses and mentors and so on. Really what they said was, Deb, like, we can try and put in an application for an extraordinary green card. Basically, the idea is that there is someone, sitting in USCIS who's making a decision. They get thousands of applicants a day. You need to stand out. You need to be the exception. You need to go build that case for yourself, and let's give it a shot. So the thing is, I was already doing all these things. But there was no way to consolidate it and like put it in a way where like that decision maker can make a decision in 6 seconds, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we did. We took a year, reapplied, and I got my green card in 14 days. And that was the birth of Kriya. So for me, it was already quite the route to even get to the point of starting the business, let alone like seeing the
Wow.
business through. And so as soon as I got my green card, I essentially I already had built the product. I'd already put in the work of getting customers. I already had traction. So I'm sharing all of this because I know that the numbers are stacked against me. So when I started my journey to apply to YC or start my fundraising journey, I wanted to show up. I was like, you have to take a chance on me because I've already done all this work,
Mm-hmm.
So that's in a nutshell how it came about. And then I'm happy to talk about specifically the YC and the
Yeah.
fundraising journey, but just wanted to share that about how I got started.
No, that's beautiful, and it's like, again, this it's a common refrain I hear from many people of, we see the achievements and see them as, these amazing breakthroughs, but there's so much under that you don't see that was required just to even get to that point and to have that opportunity to get to the breakthrough. But yeah, I would love if you share more about your YC experience and what that has both done for you and also, how you impacted them.
Oh, 100%. I think so. The way I started was I quit in May of a few years ago, and I knew nothing, Matt. I knew nothing. I didn't know what the difference between an angel investor was, a VC, what are the type of VC, nothing. So, and especially coming from corporate, you don't actually hang out in those circles and today the infrastructure is much different and the environments are different. But so in a nutshell, I had to start from scratch. And pretty quickly I had to make decisions on what are the type of investors I want to work with, what is the type of money I'm looking to raise, why I need that kind of money, what kind of business plans, deployment strategies I have, and so on. So pretty quickly I knew I wanted to raise from VCs who would be strategic partners. I don't just need capital, I need smart capital because I'm an immigrant, I'm a female. I need those introductions, I need, and so on. So firstly I knew that that's the journey I wanted to start. So I started fundraising before I even applied to accelerators. So I started, I think, fundraising, and by May I'd quit. By I think October I'd raised my first 1.3 million. So, and that was the day I also got my interview call with Y Combinator. So together, yeah, and the interview round was intense, and basically there's like people shooting questions at me left, right, and center. And a big part of the interview process was, like I said, like a lot of the decision making at the early stages is really in the founder. They're testing for your resiliency, your resolve, your belief in the problem you're trying to solve, because the solution is likely going to evolve, if
Mhm.
not pivot, but you still have to be passionate about the problem you're trying to solve. So I think they're really testing for that. Plus, they obviously tested the fact that I already had put in a lot of effort to get myself to this position. So together, I was able to close the YC round as well as close the 1.3, and then started the journey of YC, which was mind blowing. I mean, firstly, you're thrown into a room of a few, at least 100 plus other founders, and you're almost taken aback. Like, everyone is so freaking brilliant and hardworking and
Yeah.
resourceful and creative. You're just constantly inspired.
Mm.
And people are very helpful. The community has been fantastic. The group partners were amazing. So it's been hugely valuable.
And again, I think it works both ways. I think you're also adding to that community given what you did before, during, and obviously post. So, if all of that weren't enough, you're also, as you mentioned, a fashion interior design influencer on Instagram. And what it led me to think about it, and even you sharing your journey, is that you had already developed this portfolio career, even though you hadn't maybe monetized it fully yet. You had already been doing multiple things because, as you said, there's like different parts of you. And so I believe that many people going forward will embrace this, both from a as an employee, but also as employers will have to embrace it. So I'm just curious, like, how did you manage to have all of these, you know, irons in the fire to keep them going and keep them up to speed? Because you, as you mentioned, you had a full-time job and you were doing these side hustles, and as now you're a founder, you still are doing so many things. So how do you balance it all at the end of the
I think that's the first thing. Can ask my husband. I think, like I said, I think it's been a part of my journey since the very beginning. And like I said, none of the fun part about it has been, I actually have always loved my job. And that's the good, like I said, I've loved, obviously everyone has days,
day?
but I've loved my day job. So everything that I was doing on the side was really with an intention of learning, right? So, like, the first thing, I even started Instagram purely because I wanted to get better at photography. And again, photography was because my buddy was into photography and I wanted to, we wanted to go on Flickr walks together. It really started over there. And then from there, I started really getting good at DIY work because I would photograph, and then I'm like, oh, can my interior design get better? From there, I started doing fashion and so on. And then I started getting inbounds from these PR companies and, from brands. And that was really the birth of influencer marketing, which didn't exist. And I'm talking 10 years ago. So I got to witness all of that literally from its inception. So all of a sudden, it wasn't so much about the photography. That was already a skill at the back of my pocket. It wasn't so much about Instagram because I already knew how to grow. I already had community built. Now it was about what's next. So it was more about, okay, how do I turn this into services? How do I turn this into other streams of, some may call it revenue, but for me, really, it was about adding value. I don't think Kriya I wouldn't have even imagined the use case of Kriya had I not gone through these journeys. And each of them has led me to the next step. So it's been and to be super honest, like, once I moved past, like I said, like, if I got to the place where I was already getting inbounds from brands and I wasn't really interested in any of that anymore, I was past, I would turn it off, move on to the next thing and so on. Right. So I was never trying to balance it all, but it was just like trying to get to the next level from where I was at.
It sounds like you followed your curiosity, and
Yeah.
you were constantly looking for ways to be valuable to yourself, but also to others. And that allowed you to go from thing to thing to thing, and be prepared for the next thing when it presented itself.
Yeah.
So I want to switch to your personal brand for a second and ask you, what would you say is your superpower?
Gosh, this is a hard question. I think my superpower is probably, I'll give you a nerdy answer. I think my superpower is I do think I'm a really good product manager. I can take complex ideas and turn it into fantastic products. I know exactly what to cut. I know exactly what to give into. And it's not because I know it. I follow the process of, listening to the customer, listening to the market. Like, I'm really good at the art of product management. So I think professionally, I think that's my superpower. But maybe more zooming out and just personality wise, I'm restless, Matt. I have to keep doing things. That's me. It's a gift and a curse. Like,
Mhm.
if I'm not doing this, My husband was literally was like, I'm glad you finally found a DIY project you can do for the rest of your life. That's basically what it is.
And so you mentioned your husband a couple times. How has wifehood influenced your journey?
Hugely, hugely. I actually am remarried and I've been married happily for the last 10 years. This is nothing to take away from, my past relationships or anything like that. It's just that sometimes the right partner can significantly fuel your career growth. So, like I said, I came here with the dream of having a career and sending money back home and just paying off my loans, starting a family, and so on. It's really my husband Bharat who he's also from a very similar background. It's not like he grew up in wealth or anything like that. We come from the same place in India and everything. Him just giving me that confidence is like, you are good at this. So how even Kriya, the way it happened was, you spend 13 years building your career. You're looking to get to that next level in your promotion. You don't even think about giving all that up to start afresh. It's almost, some may call it dumb. And he actually told me, he was like, listen, give yourself 6 months. And he's like, I'll give you 6 months and see what happens. Worst case, you'll go back into the exact same job. If you were good at it, you will get back there. And that's very hard to digest, to be honest. And maybe some of you do lose some when you gain some. But Matt, if I hadn't quit that May, and if Bharat wouldn't have just given me those little nudges, because it's a journey of rejection. It's a journey of 7 no, or like 100 no's before a single yes or even a maybe.
Mhm.
It really tests you. But had I not quit in May, I wouldn't have raised the 1 million by October. Like, who knew? And I
Mhm.
wouldn't have had YC, and I wouldn't have raised 5 million 3 months after. It's not possible. And I never imagined, I've never seen that kind of wealth in my life. So I didn't even know what to do when the first 1 million was wired. I was like, oh, I don't know what to do with this. I was nervous. So
Yeah.
things like that, right? So he has been huge. It's one of my biggest career decisions, if anything, was marrying him.
You hit the nail squarely on the head. I think the most important career decision you can make is who you decide to partner with in life. And again, not to say you need to follow a certain path, it needs to be a certain type of relationship. Whoever you partner with, because that's who is your foundation. That's who is setting your standard of life. And I fortunate enough, I'm on the other side of it where I'm the husband to the wife entrepreneur, where I get to, I got to play that role at times. I have to play the cheerleader role. I have to play the, like,
Yeah.
I got your back. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know what you just went through. I've never sat in front of a VC and had to go through that, but I got your back. And I think that it is just amazing to kind of see what you can do when you have that support and when you have someone that no matter what you're going to go tackle, they're like, I'm here for you. And I'm 10 toes down. And so it's amazing to hear that that's been your best decision, that's enables you to do all of this.
And it's amazing to hear that about you too. I mean, I'm excited to actually learn more. I mean, I've always wanted to hear from the other person's perspective because I always feel like I'm taking so much in the relationship. Sometimes it also makes me wonder, like, when is my turn to give back as well? And it's very, relationships are so fragile. And I
Mhm.
want to make sure that I'm not losing myself in this journey and like losing something else in the process.
Yeah, and I think we think of relationships in are they balanced? And I think the use of the word balance in relationships, in work, life, it gives the wrong mental model because it's never 50-50. And also, there's never a case when I only have or I do have 100% to give. There's times when I have 110% to give. There's times when I have
Yeah.
20% to give. And it just
Yeah.
depends on where you are. And that's
Yeah.
never going to be equal. That's never going to be
Yeah.
even, because life happens and things
Yeah.
change and things move and there's ups, there's downs, there's everything in between. So I think we can sometimes have unrealistic expectations. And I think a lot of that, some of that's how we grow up, some of that's what the world shows us and whatnot. And so when you're able to find somebody that you can actually agree with how you're going to approach it,
Yeah.
it's a beautiful thing. So
100%.
have you had a mama we made it moment?
Like, for sure, like, it happens, but the reason I pause for a second is every time you feel like, oh my god, things are working, like, oh, this is it, you get hit by, okay, you did these 10 things and you found the one that's working for you until you are struck by, okay, how do you get to the next level of
Mhm.
growth? So that's been kind of like my team always tells me, like, Deb, like, stop and smell the roses.
Mhm.
Because you try 10 things, try this strategy, that idea, this, and so on. And then the one, like, okay, this is continuously driving top of funnel. We're getting the inbounds, we're getting, word of mouth and so on. And that scale at that stage sounds fantastic until you ride that wave, and then you're like, well, this curve is not good enough. Like, we needed to go there. So it is a question of, or it's a function of, again, it like, as it applies to life, you just cannot get comfortable.
Mhm.
So I do feel like we made it moments happen to get to here, but then again, you're hit by, how do we get to the next place? I like to answer that question truthfully in the context of business, because business has places to go. Personally, I feel like when I think about career and so on, for me that becomes a rat race, and I don't want to be looking at the next place to
Yeah.
go title wise and so on. So as long as I'm learning, it's exciting. So that's the same mindset, even, business wise or career wise.
Yeah. I think that in all of my conversations with people, whether they're mid career, early career, is helping them understand, because I think a lot of times we exit school and we come into a work environment where we're so used to be given grades. We're so used to given, like, oh, you did a great job on this. And that doesn't happen in work. And it doesn't, like, and then you associate it with promotions, or you associate
Yeah,
it with budget, or you associate it with managing a team. And
yeah,
you're constantly seeking out those validations, which, no matter how successful a company is, they can't freely give you those on a frequency of what you would think like you want them. And so
yeah,
you do have to find, like, how am I truly expanding my skill set? How am I
yeah.
learning? How am I being able to feed my curiosity? Because that's something that you can do on a regular basis, and it doesn't
Totally.
really end. So I'm going to close out, and hopefully we can have some fun. When they turn this amazing life story of yours into a movie, who would you want to play you on the big screen?
Oh my gosh, curveballs, Matt. uh, Let me think. I'm not like a big movie watcher, so I feel like this is not the right question for me at all. Can I say Jason Bourne, like Matt Damon?
Yeah, yeah. I love the unexpected answers, and I'll tell you why. So most people have doppelgangers, and they have people that, oh, people say you look like this person, so they normally go with that route. But then other people completely turn this question upside down and, like, rethink it, and, like, say answers I'm like, I would have never imagined you would have gone that way. So I love those answers. Um, what song would play in this trailer of this movie?
Okay. There's no association to this at all, but I'm a huge Frank Sinatra fan.
Hmm.
And so I would maybe play something like Strangers in the Night. It's
Hmm.
unrelated, but
Hmm.
that's my choice. I'm going with
Okay.
it.
All right. You learned something a lot through these conversations. So I'm a huge fan of stories. Obviously, last name doesn't hurt, but I think there's so much we can learn from sitting with someone and listening to them share firsthand their experience. But for you, if you could sit with three people, they could be with us or they could have passed on. Who would you want to hear their story firsthand?
I do want to say, I wish I would be able to have a conversation like this with my dad. Feel like that's something I would love to actually do, and you're giving me an idea here. The second story, maybe, that I would love to learn from is, I've been listening to Guy Raz and a lot of his interviews with founders, and some of the ones that really opened my mind were like Kendra Scott. Such humble beginnings. I loved how openly she spoke to her, where she came from and where it took her. So I've always felt like that's the one story that resonated with me. Even the tone of her voice, it's just so approachable. So that's one. And I'm trying to think of a third. Maybe the third would be I'm gonna throw another one. If my puppy could talk, I would love to ask him.
That
Yeah.
would be phenomenal. On your first one with your father, is your father still living?
Yeah. He's actually
So
visiting us. Yeah.
I you should do that. Sit down with him, and even if you don't do anything with it, record it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, last year my mom passed,
I'm sorry.
and I had her on the podcast. And when I tell you,
Beautiful.
it is probably the most valuable thing I own, because when I listen to it, I hear different things. And it's like, literally, depending on where I am, I can hear her giving me advice through that conversation. Even though
Wow.
it was recorded multiple years ago, every time I re-listen to it, it's almost like I'm able to have her influence and give me, like, if I'm struggling with something, like, I hear things differently.
Gosh.
And so I just highly encourage anybody that has the ability to do what we do, to do it with their parents, and to capture that and listen to it and hold on to it and cherish it very deeply, because there will come a day, unfortunately, when we won't be able to do that.
Yeah.
So definitely couldn't encourage that anymore.
Thank you. And I mean, that just came to my mind, but now I'm determined. This is amazing. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that.
So is there anything I didn't ask that you want to share, or anything you want to ask me?
No, I think this was it just went by. Like, thank you. This is a really fun conversation, and I'm glad I was able to hopefully express sufficiently.
Awesome. So if there was someone that I should have on the podcast that has an amazing story, but with one caveat, it has to be someone you can help me get, who would you suggest?
I have a few names that are coming up. Is this going to be on record?
We can take it out if you don't want to. It's up to you. Completely up to you.
One of my investors has a fantastic story. I mean, they all have fantastic stories, but one of them is particularly eye opening. I would not like this to be on record, but I would
Okay.
love to see if we can bring her on. She
Okay.
really does inspire me.
All right. Well, before I let you go, if people want to follow your story, if they want to see what you're up to, where should I send them?
Send them to deb.criya.ai. That's deb.criya.ai.
Awesome. I'll include that link. And again, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story transparently and authentically. It really means so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt.
Until next time, I encourage you, as always, to continue to share your story. It's so important, not only for you, but for others to hear your story. And if you have any feedback or any comments about any of the podcasts, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at all of the social channels at Matt E. Story, or you can go to my website, www.mattestory.com.